Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Last time we covered the advantages and disadvantages of the North. Now, an easy way to cover the advantages and the disadvantages of the South is pretty much take the advantages of the North and swap them around, and that would be a disadvantage of the South. Take the disadvantage of the North, swap it around. That's going to be the advantage of the South. So let's get started. Confederate advantages of the Civil War. Foreign allies. The South, as you remember, having been the world's supplier of raw material, raw goods, that raw cotton, a lot of foreign trade allies came out in support of the South. Now, Britain did send some soldiers over here to help fight the war, but it wasn't very many. They were kind of sitting on the outside looking in saying, who's going to actually win this war? The North or the South? If you remember, we said that the foreign allies looked at the Union as having a more stable and stronger government. However, they sympathized with the South. They said, boy, you have these poor farmers in the South. They're really just trying to fight for their rights. By the way, they supply 75% of our cotton here. And they had slaves in the South, and that's really what kept the price of cotton low. And I'm Britain, and I like to buy cotton pretty cheap, so I'm going to go ahead and sympathize and go ahead and start helping that South. Now remember, like I said, they didn't send an enormous amount of soldiers over here to help fight this war, but they knew that if the South were to lose, the price of cotton would go up because slavery would be abolished in the United States. Military officers. As you remember when I said about the North having poor officers and Lincoln having to replace his officers 6 or 7 times, quite the opposite in the South. The South had a great nucleus of trained officers. 7 of the 8 military colleges are located in the South, or they were located in the South. So you have these Southerners, and they're graduating first, second in their class. Robert E. Lee was the head of the Army of Northern Virginia, and he stayed the head of the Army of Northern Virginia until the end of the battle. You have men like James Longstreet, Lou Amistad. These guys were in charge. George Pickett, in charge, stayed in charge the whole time. They were able to win a whole lot of battles with a smaller group of men. They were trained very, very well. Being severely outnumbered by the North, the fact that they were able to win a lot of those battles, especially towards the beginning of the war, was very, very important. Military officers in the South was a big advantage of the Confederacy. Location. Just like selling a house, it was probably one of the most important things here. The location of the Confederacy made it very hard for the Union to win. So you remember how I said the Union had 600 ships, the largest navy in the world. They could blockade anything they wanted. Well, not true. The coastline of the Confederacy was about 1,600 miles, and try to blockade that with only 600 ships. Nearly impossible. The Confederacy would use these blockade runners, these smaller, lightweight ships that would go out and be able to outmaneuver these bulky naval ships from the Union, and they were able to move supplies around. You also have to remember what I said. Most of these battles were fought in the South. Not very many up in the North. You had the Western front on this battle here, the Western frontier battles that were going on about the Mississippi River, Missouri, places like that. But most of these battles were fought in the southeastern part of the United States. It was a defensive battle. They said, hey, You come to us. We're going to sit back and wait and just pick you off when you come into town here. Remember what I said before, 10,500 battles, almost all of them fought in the South, and they were just defending their territory. If you were from Wisconsin and you had to go down to Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina to fight, that's a long way to go. You're far away from your family, you miss your friends, but when you're in South Carolina and the battles are in South Carolina, you have one up on that visiting Union Army. You know the location, you know the geography, you know the hiding places. So location is definitely an advantage of the South. A purpose. The South had a purpose to fight this war. They knew that they were right in their stance with state rights. They felt they were right in the stance of having slavery. Nobody was going to tell them otherwise. They were right. We're fighting with this purpose. We are fighting to protect our rights rather than just the North being, remember, not into it, preserve the Union, blah, blah, blah. Who cares about the Union? They're like, hey, we have the right to fight for our rights, to fight for slavery. They used God as a divine reason to be in charge of other people. They should have slaves. There's nothing wrong with having slaves. This is what the Southerners thought. This is what they believed. They believed it with their heart. They believed it with their brain. So when they came to fight in this war, it was really, what do they say? If you have nothing to fight for, right? If you have nothing to fight for, you're not going to give a good fight. But if you have something to fight for, you are going to fight until the death. And that's what a lot of these guys did. So you can see that there wasn't very many advantages to the South. There was probably more disadvantages than advantages. But just quickly again, right? Quickly, they had the foreign allies because of trade. They had the best military officers. They had great location. And they fought with a purpose. That's what kept them going for so long in this war. Now the disadvantages. The South had an overabundance of disadvantages that helped lead to their defeat in the Civil War. They were outnumbered, outsupplied, and outfought. Some of the major disadvantages of the Confederacy. Their ships. They had very few warships. Remember, the Union had them all, 600 in their Navy, so they really couldn't fight in the open sea. Even though some of these battles didn't involve more than 2 ships at a time, the rebel army or the rebel navy was non-existent. They had to take regular ships and try to build them into warships, naval ships. They would be able to harass mercantile ships and transporting supplies and such, but there was no way that they could win one-on-one battles with Northern Union Army ships. So their navy, non-existent navy, is a disadvantage. The coastline, even though the location was an advantage, it was also a disadvantage to the Confederacy. Advantage because, hey, we have 1,600 coastline miles, right? All the fightings come to us. We know the location. However, having such a large coastline, it was a benefit to sneaking supplies in and out of the South. It was hard to defend. They nearly did not have enough ships to be able to defend this coastline. If there was a ship guarding this area, that Union ship would just travel a couple miles down and there would be wide open space to be able to attack the land. So with this non-existent navy, the Union was able to wreak havoc on many southern port cities like Charleston and New Orleans. Charleston doesn't turn back into the Union hands until towards the end of the war. After it was taken at the First Battle of Fort Sumter, it was bombarded the whole time until the end of the war. So this Union Navy was able to get in and out of different ports because the Confederate Navy just could not protect all that area. Population. As you remember when I covered the advantage of the North, population is a disadvantage to the South. They were outnumbered 2.5 times in the South. There's a pie chart. Look at that difference, 71% to 29%. There was about 21.5 million people in the North, about 9 million in the South, in which from those 9 million, about 4 million were slaves. So you're really only talking about 5 million white farmers, white people of the South to be able to fight. That's a huge difference in population when you're talking about the amount of people who are able to fight on the battlefield. Banking. The Union had the banks. Remember what we said. All that banking, trading, mercantile stuff is in the northeastern part of the United States. The South was based on agrarian farms, right? It was based on farming. So all the wealth was in the United States, in the Union part of the United States. After the Confederacy broke off, each state wound up creating its own money, which created a whole problem in its own. Whose money was worth more than somebody else's money? Oh my gosh, I don't know. It wasn't until about a year after the war started that the South actually came together and created one currency. Okay, because from that first year of breaking off, you had currency from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, Louisiana, Florida. Who was worth more? You have all this different type of money, currency, trading around. The Southern economy starts to falter. It takes them a whole year just to figure out how to make a good, solid currency. Industry. The lack of industry in the South, because it was based on our culture, was huge. They only had 1% of the factories in the South. They did have most of the food. They grew a lot of the food in the South, but look at these numbers here, what they had. They only held 3% of musket factories, 4% of the railroads, 6% of cloth, and 10% of all iron works were in the South. There was only one factory to compare to one factory out of 10 were located in the South. They actually had to start melting church and plantation bells to build their cannons. Transportation. Out of the 30,000 miles of railroad track, 22,000 were in the north, 8,000 were in the South, which meant that if they had to get anywhere, they had to walk a lot of places. Remember what I said, a lot of these battles are taking part in the southeastern part of the United States where there's no train tracks. There's a train tracks right there. You have to walk. You have to pull these cannons to these places. Yeah, you might have horse and oxen doing it, but you're tired, you're exhausted, you're angry, you're upset, you're hungry, and by the time you get there, you have to fight a battle. And that's how you lose battles in the Civil War. You're tired, you're exhausted, you finally get there with your stuff, and you just can't fight. So those are the main disadvantages and some advantages of the Confederacy during the Civil War.